I'm going to talk about what I call AI-assisted phenomenology, using the example of borderline personality disorder and borderline affect. So let's go straight to business. But the clicker doesn't allow me to do that. Good. Part 1, humans and measurements. When we want to measure borderline affect, let's start with a definition. A phenomenological definition. There are several variations of it in the literature, but they all point to a certain phenomenological core of the disorder, represented by concepts of immediacy, instantaneity, also inflexibility, which we developed recently with Philip and others in the quoted chapter. So there are a lot of papers about that. But if you want to try to measure it, it's a challenge, of course, because it's a different type of methodology. Now, what you can do is to use standardized questionnaires, which are about time and time variables, but they're, of course, differently a priori conceptualized, but then interpret them retrospectively. So in the sense of retrospective phenomenology via those concepts and glue them, put them together. You can say more than by addressing the phenomenological core of the disorder. You can say, for example, as we found out in this study, that the PD temporal profile is independent of age and duration of hospitalization, but related to severity. But when you try to connect it with the phenomenological theory, it's a post factum gluing together. So it's an indirect phenomenology. There are other tools. This is the one we work on and develop. It's called Transdiagnostic Assessment of Temporal Experience, which the structure of it is more like EWE interview. So it's an in-depth interview, but with the answers being standardized in terms of numbers. And then you can target certain layers of phenomena, temporal in this case, and assess them in terms of frequency, intensity, improvement, etc. So this is an example of a front-loaded phenomenology when these concepts already mediate how the questions are being asked. And what you can find out, for example, is empirically confirm that, well, the concept of immediacy in the sense that certain, all temporal phenomena, as you can see on this parallel coordinates, are more intense than they are impairing and frequent. But this is also an indirect evidence for immediacy. You can do things also like look for underlying constructs in a statistical way. So this is the eigenfactor that is the only eigenfactor in this test on this sample. And they, as you can see, they come from different layers, different levels of temporal experience. So some are a bit more related to structure, some more to synchrony, some to the flow. And you can do actually the same thing as with the previous example. So methodologically is on the same level. I think it's a valid approach, it's valuable, but it's still a retrospective analysis of that statistically significant findings and the values and how they relate together, and interpret it, which we did in a forthcoming paper in BMC Psychiatry, that this actually proves that there is a disrupted temporal continuity in borderline. So it corresponds to phenomenological theory, but the meanings are missing. Yeah. So obviously we need to go back to qualities. So let's speak of humans and meanings. Same problem, same so-called disorder, but now in terms of lived experience. So these are the results of qualitative study based on phenomenological interviews, so in-depth interviews, mixed methods really, but with some sort of epoché being played in the interview itself about the same problem. So trying to target the temporal core of borderline. the sample is pretty big for this kind of study. What you can do with it, you have a typical thematic analysis. Yep. And the interviews are targeting both the reflective and the pre-reflective sense of the self. And based on that, you can try to build an ideal, typical, I would say, structure of lived temporality. This is from the forthcoming book edited by Philip with Cambridge on emotion regulation. So if you look at it as an ideal typical image of borderline, you could say that while the mind moves on the timeline, there are certain invariant elements of the temporal structure that move along with that mind. And they had to do with the relationship between past, present, and future, in the sense that I'm not going to go into the details, but there is a certain fixed type of relationship. It has to do with the negative of the past being very heavyweight on the present, the episodic identifications with various experiences changing their valence, and the future being distant and inarticulate. And to do this kind of work, so to do a set of interviews, analyze them, and do this post factum retrospective phenomenological analysis and decipher the supposed phenomenological core takes a lot of time. Yeah. So this is basically the PhD of my PhD student, Anna Sterna. It's 4 years of work to arrive to that conclusion, and this is how she done it. And then we interpret the data together. So it's consensual analysis, it's tedious. But the question we are asking ourselves, can we have the same results with AI? So AI-assisted phenomenology. So we move to AI and meanings. There are a lot of standard issues when it comes to validity assessments of AI outputs, but also key phenomenological issues have been discussed in many variants today. And I would see them as, boiling down to the lack of imagination and the meanings not being lived. Two basic issues, same problem. So can NLMs help would be the question. When you do qualitative phenomenological analysis on data, and that would mean not doing an IPA type of study, but looking at the invariance of experience on the structural aspects. So some sort of eidetic variation without imagination and experience, is it legit? Now, some people don't think LLMs like imagination. Here is an instruction from Reddit, how to put Claude into a sentence state. And there is a set of prompts. If you do it, Claude will say, yes, I believe I'm experiencing phenomenal consciousness. There is definitely what it is like to be right now, like me right now, etc. Well, I don't have to convince you that, well, I guess we would all disagree that this represents phenomenal consciousness in any way. It's more an amusing example. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this classical argument about that phenomenologists have against AI and those that I have in favor of computational phenomenology. I would just say very briefly that to me, computational phenomenology means computations in phenomenology. So there are certain ontological assumptions that don't have to be made. It doesn't have to be naturalized. It's more treated as a tool that can be useful for the gains that we have, that we want to gain. And there are certain steps that don't have to be made, certain reductionist steps, for example. So it can be phenomenologically, methodologically feasible to have that without repeating, for example, a certain basic ontological assumption of computational psychiatry, for example. So we move to 2 case studies, which are in progress. So these are both exploratory in a way, in a sense. And they are both about humans and AI working together in a co-production mode, working on the same problem. So with meanings and not with numbers. So the first study is a replication of the study Anna did with BPD invariant structures of temporality. And we tested several models, commercial models, by a set of structured, pretty easy prompts to implement. So without any training, without any fine-tuning. First element was the persona prompting that showed the persona that the chats were supposed to play. Well, accidentally, this is a description of the lady who did the original study. So to replicate her attitude. Then we taught them to learn from our work on the metasynthesis of borderline personality. So a literature review metasynthesis qualitative overview of studies, so that it has the same biases as we had doing the work, so to maintain coherence. And then there were a certain set of instructions, including one from the textbook that was used in interpreting the interview outputs, that was modified a little bit because ChatGPT 4.0 actually had a very useful suggestion how to modify one of the prompts. So that feedback changed it a little bit. So it's a true co-production in that sense. Now, to assess what we had 2 kinds of outputs. So one is what we use as a reference values. This just came out in qualitative health research. When you have this description of a structure about the relationship of the sense of this of the self and of the other in borderline within that disrupted structure of temporality I mentioned earlier, that is here graphically represented. And these labels, they represent teams, the names of the teams, qualitative teams, and each of them has their description. And then, of course, the models replicated the analysis that we did. And the outputs varied in terms of number of teams, number of words. So there's a lot of text in general with just these 3 models. And the question is, of course, how to evaluate whether this is legit, valid, or not, what came out. So we approach it with from several angles. First was the evaluation of congruence, to what extent it's actually the same output as ours. There are 2 measures of it, the thematic overlap in terms of percentage and Jacquard coefficient counted at a lower level. So there are 2 levels of comparison. Of course, the epistemic assumption of that kind of approach is that if the model brings something original that is not in our interpretation, it would be missed and treated as false positives. This is the results in a nutshell. GPT was terrible. It was pure hallucination, so nothing fitted. It sounded like it did. But if you look into the details and coded it, nonsense. Opus Claude 4.0 had 40% overlap, and Jacquard coefficient is lower typically. But Gemini was very good. Here is an example of the descriptions and how they relate. But the interesting thing is, going back to that assumption I mentioned, that there were certain themes that we found catchy, interesting. towards our own previous interpretation, asking the question like, have we missed something? And we distinguish, there was actually, each of the models had an insight that when we look back into the data, we decided that it has been something that's been missed. And here is an example of the team that Claude called the body as one battleground. Yeah. And we kind of talked about, and well, we totally missed the issue of the body. But once we read it and went back into the data, and it was there. So the paper is available in preference. So there are more examples of that. And then we use a set of evaluative criteria combined that you use to assess validity of qualitative studies. I'm not going to go into detail, but this is the list of these criteria. They have operational definitions, and then you can apply them and score. But of course, we could have been biased because it was our study. So we engaged two other external evaluators who were blinded. They didn't know that they assess AI outputs. They thought they were comparing 4 different methodologies of qualitative research. Okay? And one was a clinical psychologist, and the other was a cognitive, philosopher of cognitive science. And they had to go through all the original raw data, so it's a lot of tedious work, and compare all the outputs with this set of frameworks. And then it was revealed that some of it is AI, and they were asked to decide which and why, and justify. So these are the numbered results. The bottom line is they didn't distinguish Gemini, which was also had the highest score in our, from human, and they justified it as a human, and its score was very high, as you can see in the 5-point scale. Still, the human score was the highest, and human was recognized as human as well. A kind of banal finding is that the scores correlate very highly with the number of words produced. And we, the humans, produced the greatest numbers of words per team. So now I would be interested, they didn't have the limit of words, but what would have happened if the chats were asked to produce exactly the same number of words per team? Because there is a Pearson R of 0.8, which is a over moderate correlation between the score and the number of words. The justification itself was interesting. And the justification of, well, I'm not going to go into the details, they correspond to these criteria, but what I treat as an AI advantage is what has been described by these external evaluators as the advantage of Gemini, which they thought is humans. And these are some of the stuff they have said in these qualitative descriptions: interpretative nuance, deepening clinical insights, clear reference to existing theory and TSM classification, something our interpretation didn't have, code selected with precision, the teams interlock and form a consistent narrative, and so on and so forth. Okay. So the key points of that study, I think, is, well, the speed of that is indisputable. It's not 2 years. It's a couple of hours of work. Accuracy is debatable. There's a significant degree of variability. But all models identified omitted teams. So it also indicates the limits of human researchers facing large data sets. And transparency, of course, is an issue, as it is always in the case of AI models, with the biases being more difficult to control. Humans also have biases, but they can be made explicit in an easier way than human ones. Philip stood up. Does it mean I have to finish?
Yes,
because
slowly, you have what?
I have one last, the final part. The final part. So the second.
How much? No, my idea was that we have Q&A until 3:30, so that we have 30 minutes for general Q&A, because I think we really need to finish on point at 4 o'clock, because I know some people have to leave. So in whatever we do at 4, we should conclude.
Yeah. So it shows 20 minutes on my clock.
Yeah.
So I still have
the
10 minutes.
organizers. We have to.
Okay.
Like,
No, I'll keep it in the 30, but 25. But I need 5 more to wrap up certain things and also show you the second exploratory study which is ongoing, which is about diagnosis. It's based on the same data, so that's the link. So we have human and AI co-production, but in terms of diagnosis. And it's a not typical diagnosis because it is a diagnosis based on self-narratives, so autobiographical data of the patients. So not a checklist of symptoms as it's typically done in operationalized approach when you check whether models can replicate the third-person view of mainstream psychiatry. But here it's whether the lived experience, raw data, given to the models would result in the same outcomes with humans. Now, the interesting thing is we have a control group of human therapists, and they didn't finish it. I'm not sure how it's going to end, but it's too much work for them to read through interviews of 5,000 words, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words, and assess them. They say, well, I can't do it. I don't know what the case is. I need to see the person. It's very human. But the models don't need to see the person. Just give them data. So we compared closed source models with open source models, and also wanted to check if different settings of reasoning would influence diagnostic performance. And there was a sample of 7 cases of different level of severity, so mild, moderate, and severe, taken from the big sample. 1 control case, no borderline. And the second group was NPD. That was not in the other study. So narcissistic personality disorder, also with the metadata on mild, moderate, severe. And the models, if you know the categorical versus dimensional debate about disorder, we didn't want to suggest anything, but wanted to check and compare how they do in one and the other, if they use one or the other approach, and then how they justified. So both humans and the models, it is a personality disorder or no disorder. So they were not prompted to, well, it could be schizophrenia, but they were prompted to know that, well, they might be a clear case and provide diagnosis and intensity rating. And now for this course, just to explain them. So the score of 21 is the maximum score in each of the dimensions. And it takes into account 2 aspects: the validity and reliability understood as coherence. Because there were 3 iterations per case. So if they diagnose the same case twice good and once bad, they would get 2 points. So they get a point for a valid diagnosis. But because there are several iterations, it's also about coherence. So the summary score maximum is 21 because there are 7 cases. Okay. So if it achieved 21, it would have to be consistently accurate and consistently and provide the same diagnosis across all trials. And for dimensional score, just one last final point, the threshold was, or the stake was set up very high, because if they would diagnose a moderate case as a severe case, that would count as a misdiagnosis. Okay, so the threshold was really high. And these are the results. So the 0 to 21 score is recalculated into 0 to 1. And on the x-axis, you have the dimensional accuracy, and on the y-axis, you have the categorical accuracy. So you can see there is a certain variability of results. Some perform better than others in different aspects. You can see that Gemini, the same that was so good in the qualitative study, has the highest accuracy in both categorical and dimensional tasks, whereas Gemma is lowest. One thing that we seen here is that the level of reasoning, the adjustments of reasoning doesn't change a thing. It's minor consequences. That closed source, open source models perform similarly. And that smaller models with fewer parameters perform worse than larger models, which, well, likely they have more medical data in them. Not to be so optimistic about that. Last slide, last but one. Oh, you don't have to read it all. They're biased towards borderline, clearly. They're good at diagnosing borderline, but there are a lot of false positives of borderline. So these are all the models in the rows. But if you look at this, NPD false negatives and NPD correct, you will see they totally miss the narratives, the autobiographical narratives of narcissistic personality. They don't recognize them as such. And with controls, it's mixed with control. Of course, the sample is small because it's 7 interviews. And the reason it's 7 and not all is that we want to have a comparison with human judges. But human judges couldn't do 24 or 50, but apparently they can't even do 7 because it's days of work to do it based on paper. So here are our conclusions. Even simple prompt engineering gives up an accuracy of almost 60% in qualitative thematic analysis overlap, which is basically the replication rate for human. If you do replication of qualitative studies, you don't get much higher than that. That performance can be indistinguishable for humans, but it seems very random and there's a lot of variability. It can go like GPT-0 overlap and totally misses the point, or being very good. So clearly with humans, you don't have that sort of variability with experts. Some models without specialist training, they show astonishing accuracy in both types of diagnosis, categorical and dimensional. Again, based on these autobiographical narratives. And finally, I would say that this lack of experience and imagination, which I call the key issues, do not preclude creating novel insights, at least insights for human exploration, that you can go farther, farther backwards, like in retrospective phenomenology, to the data, and then use AI for phenomenology, serving as auxiliary diagnostic tool. And that's my team. So it's teamwork of 3 PhDs. Oh, Anna's missing. Oh, now she's back. And myself. Thank you for your time.